Yo, what's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Fantasy Football Prodigy channel, and in this video, I'm going to give you my top startums and situms heading into week 4 of the 2021 fantasy football season, my top starts and sits. But before we get into that, I am going to do a quick little recap of my week 3 calls. So we're going to start with the quarterback position here for our little recap and just work our way down. So starting with my quarterback starts of week 3. Remember, this is for last week, so I'm just recapping. I said Jalen Hurts would finish as a quarterback 1. He ended up being the quarterback 9 in week 3, so that was a good call. And by the way, a quarterback 1 or a running back 1 means top 12. So like if it's a quarterback 2, it'd be 13 to 24. So it's just segments of 12, basically, assuming that it's a 12-team league. That's just what I go off of. So I said he would be a quarterback 1, finished as a quarterback 9. He had 22.54 points. The Eagles' offense looked bad, but Jalen Hurts can run the ball a little bit. He didn't go crazy rushing, but he had a few points on the ground, I think, and he had some good garbage time production. I also said to play Teddy Bridgewater as a low quarterback 1 and a high quarterback 2. So while Jalen Hurts was a big hit for the channel, Teddy Bridgewater did not really do much for fantasy. He was a quarterback 26, had 11.8 points. Honestly, the Denver Broncos just blew out the Jets 26-0. Melvin Gordon and Javonte Williams each had a rushing touchdown. So Teddy honestly didn't have to do much. It's not like he played poor or anything. He just didn't really need to do anything in the air. So this was a miss, but I still like Teddy moving forward as a nice streaming option. Daniel Jones, he was the quarterback 5 on the season heading into last week, and he had a great matchup with the Atlanta Falcons. I had him as a low quarterback 1, high quarterback 2. He finished as a quarterback 20 in week 3. He had 16.54 points. He had some players leave during the game, some wide receivers leave in the middle of the game. He had 0 touchdowns in the game, and he just didn't have a great game for fantasy, but he wasn't terrible. He finished as a quarterback 20, but he was only 3 points away from finishing as a quarterback 15, which would have been 19.54 points. So I'll count this as a miss, but it wasn't like a drastic, strikeout swing and a miss. In terms of quarterback sits, I said to sit Jameis Winston, and he did indeed finish pretty bad. Quarterback 25, only had about 13.5 points, so that was definitely a hit, which means that was a good call. If I say a hit, that means it's a good call. If I say a miss, it's a bad call, just in case you didn't know. We're going to move on to last week's week 3 running back starts. I said to play Tyson Williams, running back of the Baltimore Ravens against the Detroit Lions. He was the RB13 on the season heading into that game. It was a good matchup. I thought he'd be a nice running back 2 play, but he was not. He finished as a running back 56, only scoring 2.2 points. And by the way, if I say the points, just assume that it's half PPR unless I note otherwise. So that means every catch is half a point. But if I say anything else, like if I mean standard scoring, I'll say that. Or full PPR, I'll say that. So I don't know what the Ravens were really thinking in this game. Tyson Williams only had 5 carries. Latavius Murray had 7. And Devonta Freeman even had 3. It was a great matchup, but Williams just didn't get enough work in the game to really do anything. No one did. They were all just getting a few carries, and no one really did much on the ground. So that was kind of a weird game plan from Baltimore, but that was a miss on my part. Another better call on my part was Saquon Barkley. He was the RB48 on the season, and people were starting to get worried about him. But I noticed that his snap percentage was increasing, and he had a really good matchup against the Atlanta Falcons. And unlike Daniel Jones, Saquon Barkley was able to capitalize on that very matchup. He finished as the running back 13 with 18.4. That'd be half PPR points. His volume continued to increase as it had been, and he took advantage of the good matchup. So that was a hit. That was a good call. And then I also said to play David Montgomery. I had him as a low running back 1, high RB2. That's for the Chicago Bears. He finished as a running back 40 in week 3. He only had 6.5 points. But honestly, the Bears offense looked so bad with Justin Fields starting his first ever game. And I'm honestly surprised that David Montgomery was able to get over 5 points with how historically bad the passing game was, because that obviously affects the offense as a whole. So that was a miss. But you should feel lucky if you played him and got 6.5 points, because it could have been way worse. And then my only running back sit call was Darrell Henderson against for the Rams. He was going against the Buccaneers, but he didn't even play. After that, we got our wide receiver starts. I went with Sterling Shepard, who was the wide receiver 11 on the season. Going into that game against Atlanta, I really targeted a lot of New York Giants. Saquon was the only one that worked out, though, because Sterling Shepard finished as the wide receiver 93 in week 3 with only 2.6 points. He did leave early with an injury, though, and he only played 24 snaps, which ended up being 34% of the offensive snaps. So this was definitely not a good play for fantasy, but honestly, the process to want to start him It was a sound process. It was a good matchup, and he missed enough of the game where I won't say that it was a bad call, because you can't really predict injuries, so it's hard to say. Obviously, it wasn't good for your lineup, but I don't necessarily think it was a bad call. Rondale Moore, on the other hand, was a bad call. This was a risky play. I liked him as a nice flex play with some upside for the Arizona Cardinals against the Jacksonville Jaguars. He finished as a wide receiver 105 with only 1.4 points. He's a really talented player, and it was a good matchup. But honestly, he only saw 2 targets on 23 snaps, which was 34% of the snaps. It's really hard to produce on limited work. But that was a risk with him heading into that game. And I thought because of the matchup and his talent, maybe he'd see more snaps or maybe he'd have a big play, but none of that happened. So we will count that as a miss. But luckily, I only said to start him as a flex with upside. I wasn't making any proclamations that he was like a locked in like 1 or anything. Courtland Sutton was someone I was a little higher on. I said he was going to be a wide receiver 2 against the Jets. He finished as the wide receiver 59, had 6.2 points. It was similar to Teddy Bridgewater. Honestly, the passing game was not needed. The running backs ran in a couple touchdowns, and it was a blowout win. So I think if they had to air it out a little bit more, he could have been more productive. But honestly, he just wasn't needed. So a couple of misses there. All my wide receiver starts were actually misses that week. So that, except for, I won't count Sterling, but it definitely wasn't a hit. So that was pretty rough. And then my wide receiver sit was Jalen Waddle, he had a really weird week. So he was the wide receiver 27 in half PPR, the wide receiver 19 in PPR, and the wide receiver 50 in non-PPR in week 3. So it was a great call in non-PPR because he was a wide receiver 50, but in PPR, in full PPR, he was a top 20 wide receiver. In half PPR, he was a wide receiver 27. That's because he saw 13 targets and he got 12 of them, but he only had 58 yards. So that was such an odd box score, but Jacoby Brissett was able to get him the ball for a lot of short passes. So if you played him in PPR, he actually had an okay game. It's good to see the targets, but yeah, that was a really weird box score. And I think those are, I had a couple tight end plays as well. We got 2 more players to recap here. I said to play Mark Andrews, who got off to a slow start on the year. He was the tight end 18 heading into week 3 against the Detroit Lions. I said to play him as I don't know what I ended up, I think like a tight end 1, like a mid tight end 1, I think. He finished as a tight end 6. He had 13.4 points. And I did buy low on him in one league. I talked about that in a different buy low, sell high video to buy Mark Andrews. I bought low on him in week 2. And he took advantage of the matchup with Detroit. He had over 100 yards, and he didn't even have a touchdown. So he put up that many points, that great of a fantasy day, without getting in the end zone. So that is great to see. So that was definitely a hit. And then Austin Hooper, I liked to play him last week as a high tight end 2. He finished as a tight end 13 with 8.9 points. So he was as high of a tight end 2 as he could be without being a tight end 1. So I nailed that. But we did get lucky with a touchdown catch, making up for most of his production. He had 8.9 points, 6 of those coming from a touchdown. But honestly, that's the game that we play whenever we're streaming this god-awful position that is tight end. But yeah, so we had some hits and some misses. I feel like it wasn't as successful as the previous week, but we're going to learn and we're going to make some good calls today. All right, now we're going to move on to my top starts and sits heading into week 4 of the 2021 fantasy football season, and we are going to go by position. I'll go with the starts first, and then I'll give you my sits. So we're going to start with the quarterback position, and my first start of the week is going to be Derek Carr of the Las Vegas Raiders, and I have a few things to say about him. So first and foremost, he is not a must-start quarterback. So you might have better options, but I'm just going to go through a few things here so you can make that decision for yourself. So he's currently the quarterback 9 in fantasy football, which is really impressive. I don't think many people expected that. And here he is on the list on Fantasy Bros with 23.8 points per game. That's his average. If you look all the way up at quarterback 4, though, the average is 24.4 with Jalen Hurts. So Derek Carr is currently 0.6 points per game away from being the quarterback 4 in all of fantasy football. You add 0.1 to that, he is the 4th best. So he would be tied for Hurts if you added 0.6. But if you add 0.7, he's the 4th best in all of fantasy football. And the reason I bring that up is just to let you guys know that he is playing really good football. He's putting up a lot of fantasy points this year. And while it feels like the wheels could fall off of the car, pun intended, at any point, I think this could be another good week for him against the Chargers. I think he could be productive. I don't think he'll have a great blow-up game. Because the Chargers defense has been pretty good this year. They haven't been allowing too many points to quarterbacks. But I think while he's not a top quarterback 1 play for me. He's not a must start. He does seem like a safe high quarterback 2, especially if you're in a 2 quarterback league. This is someone that I would consider, but again, I am not saying that he is like a top 5 quarterback or anything like that. He's more of a top end quarterback 2 for me this week. Moving on to my second and final quarterback start of the week, though, is a guy who he might be a must start. It depends who you have on your team, because you probably were able to get Stafford pretty late. And if you drafted 2 quarterbacks and you're in a 1 quarterback league, you might not have to play him, but Matt Stafford of the LA Rams is someone that I'm very interested in for week 4. He's currently the quarterback 7 on the season. He's been great. And this is just a reminder to keep riding the Stafford and Cup train. This week, he gets the Arizona Cardinals. That could be a matchup that is high scoring, potentially if it's a shootout. And for me, this week in week 4, he is a mid quarterback 1. Now I'm going to move on to my one and only quarterback sit of the week, and that is going to be Daniel Jones, Danny Dimes of the New York Giants. He's been playing not horrible this year. He's been taking much better care of the ball than he had in the past. And he was the quarterback 5 overall heading into week 2 of the season. But last week in week 3, he finished as the quarterback 20. Some of his options are currently banged up, and he has a tough matchup against the New Orleans Saints in week 4, who are giving up the second fewest points per game to quarterbacks. So while I do like Daniel Jones long term, and I think he's shown a lot of promise this year and some growth, he's someone that I'm probably not going to start this week unless I'm in a 2 quarterback league and I'm really, really desperate. All right, now I'm going to move on to the running back position, where I have my first start of the week, and that's going to be Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers. He's filling in for an injured Christian McCaffrey, so he should see plenty of volume against the Dallas Cowboys. If you added him, you likely added him to play him. He probably costs a decent amount of fab, and the Panthers are currently said last I heard that they're not putting McCaffrey on injured reserve. So if he was put on injured reserve, that would mean he would have to miss, I believe it's at least 3 games. But since they're not putting him on IR, that means he could return as soon as a week or 2 from now. So if you added him to your team, now is the time to play him against Dallas. I like him as a top 20 running back play this week. And oh boy, I don't know why I keep doing this to myself, but I'm going to bet on David Montgomery here. He was a start of the week last week. I can't remember if he also was in week 2. No, he wasn't. Thank goodness. Okay. It was only 1 week. But it hasn't been pretty for the Bears the last couple weeks. If you saw the game again, or in week 3, the Bears offense was so bad, but he still somehow had 55 yards in a pitiful offensive team performance in week 3. Now he gets a really good matchup with the Detroit Lions. And while he probably has limited upside in this current offense, I think the matchup and his talent make him a high running back 2. So he probably is someone that you are going to put in your lineup. It is a little bit risky given how the offense looked with Justin Fields last week. But again, this matchup is pretty good, and I could see them trying to take some of the pressure off of Fields and letting Montgomery kind of carry a little bit. All right, so now I'm going to talk about my running back sits of the week. And honestly, other than Daniel Jones, I have 3 more sits for week 4, and they're all running backs. So I'm going to go over the rest of my sits right here. They're all running backs, and we're going to start with Tyson Williams of the Baltimore Ravens. I'm also going to include Latavius Murray in this as well. We'll go over him as well. They are both running backs for the Baltimore Ravens, and these guys are honestly just cannibalizing each other's fantasy value too much for either one of them to be productive. For one of them to be productive, you're going to need one of a few things. You're going to need touchdown luck. One of them is going to have to fall into the end zone, which could happen. Now, if one of these guys gets in the end zone and he's on your bench, but they don't have a lot of yards, that still shows that it's a good process. It's just that touchdowns are hard to predict. You're going to need touchdown luck in general, or a long breakaway play, a long breakaway touchdown, something like that. Or we're going to need someone to seize the lead role. So through 3 weeks, we have seen really no one take a stranglehold of this role. It's been a split backfield, and you saw in week 3 against the Detroit Lions, no one had more than 7 carries in a great matchup. And this week they get the Denver Broncos, who are currently giving up the second fewest points to running backs in all of fantasy. And the fourth thing that these guys would need to be more relevant for fantasy, at least for me heading into this week, would be more passing game involvement. And they're really not that involved in the passing game. In week 1, Tyson Williams had a few receptions, but yeah, it hasn't been great. We'll go over to Latavius Murray here. So as you can see, I mean, even in week 2, Tyson Williams had 13 carries, a couple receptions. Like, I would take that, but his carries have been kind of fluctuating, and to me in this matchup, it just kind of scares me against the Denver Broncos. Here's Latavius Murray again, no consistent workload, no receiving work at all. So yeah, this whole backfield scares me. Obviously, I wouldn't play Devonta Freeman either. So if one of them does fall into the end zone, then okay, we live with that. But with the limited rushing and receiving work for all of the running backs in Baltimore, plus a tough matchup with the Broncos, who are again giving up the second fewest points to running backs, I am staying away from this backfield if I can. Next up, I'm going to bring up James Conner as another player that I am probably going to be sitting in week 4. He's coming off a big week. As you can see right here, he had 11 carries for 43 yards, and he had 2 rushing touchdowns. He also had 1 catch on 1 target for 10 yards. That was against the Jacksonville Jaguars. So if you had him on your bench last week, you might have seen, oh, he had a great week last week. I have to get him into my lineup. I have to put him in my flex this week. That is something that I would really not recommend doing in week 4 against the LA Rams. I think coming off of that big week, many managers will be tempted to play James Conner, but I would not expect nearly the same production that he got last week against Jacksonville. The Jacksonville Jaguars are a good matchup, and the team was able to get out to a lead. As you see, they won 31-19. That led to a good game script, which allowed him to be more involved on the ground and find plenty of fantasy success just because of the matchup in general. And the 2 touchdowns is really what propelled him to having a great performance. If you take those touchdowns away, I don't think anyone is thinking about playing him. And while he could fall into the end zone in week 4, touchdowns are pretty hard to predict unless your name is like Devontae Adams or Derrick Henry or something. I'm certainly not going to bet, oh, James Conner is a for sure bet to get into the end zone. That's never something that I'm going to say. With limited volume, a tough matchup against the Rams, and barely any involvement in the passing game, I'm not going to be chasing last week's points. And Conner, for me, is a low running back 3 at best, who will need to find his way into the end zone to be worth playing. And my final running back sit overall of the list is going to be Damien Harris of the New England Patriots, who, as you see, he started the game nice against the Miami Dolphins and the New York Jets. He was seeing some good rushing work on the ground. He got in the end zone in week 2, had 100 rushing yards in week 1. Week 3, that came to a screeching halt against the Saints. 6 for 14 on the ground, caught 2 passes for -3 yards. So he was shut down by the Saints in week 3, and I honestly expect the same fate for Harris when he takes on another tough run defense in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Damien Harris of the New England Patriots, by the way, I don't know if I mentioned that, but I do not think that he will find much success on the ground. And if I'm just predicting how the game's going to go, I think Tom Brady is going to get the Buccaneers out to a lead in his return to New England, which would lead to a bad game script for Damien Harris, who has not really been involved in the passing game. And if they're losing, they're not going to be able to keep, pounding the ball like on the ground with him. Regardless of the game script, Harris hasn't been involved in the passing game, but that could change this week. James White of the New England Patriots, their pass catching specialist running back, is currently out for the season. So Damien Harris could see more involvement in the passing game, but they have another of other kind of running back options who could take over that James White role, or maybe it'll be a kind of like a committee of players that are filling that role. So we really just don't know. So to me, Damien Harris is someone that he's going to be more of an RB3/flex play for me with not very much upside. And honestly, if you do play him, you're just hoping and praying that he gets a touchdown. All right, now I'm going to move on to my wide receiver starts. I don't have any sits for the list. There was no one that I really felt really passionate about saying. And one thing to note, guys, is this. Robby Anderson is on this list, okay? And then this is where this is a great part of the video to explain something. I'm saying start Robby Anderson. He's a start of the week, whatever you want to call it. Just because he's on the list doesn't mean that he is like a must-start player. So, for example, I would much rather play DJ Moore on the same team of the Carolina Panthers, fellow wide receiver, than Robby Anderson. But I'm not going to put DJ Moore on this list because no one is really thinking about benching DJ Moore unless your team is just unbelievably, ungodly goated. So that's just a point I'd like to make here. So I'm going to talk about Robby here, though, about why I think he could have a good week. So I think that this could be a squeaky wheel game for Robby Anderson. He's only had 11 targets through 3 games. You can see his targets right there. But I could see in week 4 against the Dallas Cowboys with no Christian McCaffrey, I could see him absorbing a few more short area targets, which would be nice, especially in a little PPR, get some dump offs there. Any game with the Dallas Cowboys has the potential to be high scoring with the offense that the Cowboys has, which is great for all players involved in the game. I have in my notes here, obviously I like DJ more than Robby Anderson, but this is just me saying that Robby is a potential option this week. He was actually dropped in one of my leagues, and I put in a big fab claim for him. It's a really deep league. It's not a dynasty. It's a redraft with pretty deep benches, and I put in like over 50%. It was quite a bit, like 50 to 75% of my fab budget overall. So I might even up that a little bit because I think that, I don't know about his long-term outlook, but I think in the short term with McCaffrey out, we could see him be a little bit more involved. Maybe it's someone that if he has a good game here against Dallas, maybe you trade him away before McCaffrey comes back. Not saying that once McCaffrey comes back, Robby will revert to barely getting any targets, but it's hard to say. We're just going off of what we've seen so far. But with all that being said, he currently this week for me is a low wide receiver 3, high wide receiver 4 that you could play in a pinch, especially if you're in a wide receiver 3 league. He also comes with a lot of upside because he does have that big playability. And if he doesn't do anything this week in this situation, in a potentially high scoring game without Christian McCaffrey, that's when I would start to get pretty darn worried about Robby Anderson. All right, my next inclusion on the list is currently the wide receiver 2 in all of fantasy football, but I still think he's worth talking about because he's someone who's been in the league for a little bit and has not put up this much consistent production in his career, and that's going to be Mike Williams of the Chargers. Like I said, he's a wide receiver 2 in all of fantasy, and he struggled with consistency in the past. He's missed some games with injury, but it seems like he's finally putting it all together. Justin Herbert and him are looking great together on the field. And so what I have to say about Mike Williams here is, well, all wide receivers have bad games, and Mike Williams certainly will not be as hot as he's been for the rest of the year, right? He's not going to continue to put up this type of production as you see on the screen right here. 82 yards, 91 yards, 122 yards. He's had a touchdown in every game. I do not expect that type of insane video game-like production to continue, but Mike Williams has become a borderline must-start player until we see him stop being so darn great at football. I played Courtland Sutton over Mike Williams last week, which cost me about 23 points in a matchup that I lost by only a couple points, and I will be starting Williams against the Las Vegas Raiders in that league 100%. In that game, for me, he is a high-end wide receiver 2 with tons and tons and tons of upside. My final wide receiver start of the week is going to be Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers. Now, every time we have 49ers on this list, it's a little... you never know what exactly is going to happen because their coach is sometimes unpredictable. Deebo Samuel, though, weeks 1 and 2, week 1, 9 for 189 and a touchdown. Week 2, 6 for 93. He also had a couple carries for 8 yards. Week 3 against the Packers, 5 receptions for 52 yards. His worst game of the season. He did still see 10 targets, though, which is what I love to see. He did have a bit of a down game last week, but I really love that he saw double-digit targets in a game where Brandon Ayuk and George Kittle were also pretty involved. Ayuk is involved as he's been all season, so it showed that even when those guys are getting some targets, Deebo still had double-digit targets, which is nice. So unless the offense suddenly heavily shifts to George Kittle and or Brandon Ayuk in this game against the Seattle Seahawks, I expect Deebo to have a great game. And for me, he's a wide receiver too. And I'm a Vikings fan, and I watched that game last week where the Vikings played Seattle, and the Vikings were really just able to do whatever they wanted on offense. And the 49ers also have a good offense, so I could definitely see them having success throwing the ball to all their options, and hopefully one of them would be Deebo Samuel. All right, so kind of like I said before, these players on my list that I have starting as starts of the week, I'm obviously not going to say, oh, start Travis Kelce, because everyone's doing that. So I'm kind of digging a little deep here, so I'm not picking guys like Kelce and Waller and guys like that, or people who have had been hot. I'm picking some kind of lower mid-tier type of tight end. So we're going to start with my, I have 2 tight end starts to end off this entire video. One of them is going to be Tyler Higbee of the LA Rams. He has had a couple good games this year, and he should be a solid low-end tight end 1 with quite a bit of upside against Arizona, especially if both offenses are clicking as well as they could. As you can see, week 1, 5 receptions for 68 yards with 6 targets. That's really good for a tight end. That's like a tight end 1. Next week, he was shut out against Indianapolis, 1 catch for 8 yards. But then last week, he had 5 receptions on 5 targets for 40 yards, and he was able to get in the end zone. So this isn't like a surefire play. He's not one of those locked and loaded guys who you know every week is going to see tons of production. But if you got him late in your draft, or even if he's on your waiver wire for some reason, this is someone that you could plug into your lineup and play as a low-end tight end 1 this week. And next up, I'm going to talk about Logan Thomas of the Washington football team. He's pretty close in rankings with Tyler Higbee. I think Higbee might have a little bit more upside. But Logan Thomas, he gets an Atlanta Falcons defense that allowed 1 touchdown to Dallas Goedert in week 1 and 2 touchdowns to Rob Gronkowski in week 2. And that same Falcons defense, they played Evan Ingram and the New York Giants in week 3. And Evan Ingram didn't have a great game, but Evan Ingram at this point honestly doesn't expose too many matchups very often. He's usually pretty quiet most weeks, so I wouldn't be too worried about them shutting him down. The Falcons defense is not very great, and you could do a lot worse than Logan Thomas. He's kind of like a low to mid tight end 1 play for week 4. All right, those are all of my starts and sits that I felt like a powerful opinion about, something worth talking about. So that's going to do it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Please make sure to drop a like on the video if you enjoyed it or found it helpful. Subscribe to the channel for more fantasy football content, and I will talk to you guys later. Peace out.